France's direct colonial involvement in Indonesia was relatively limited compared to other European powers, like the Dutch or the British, but it still had a notable influence in the region. French colonial ambitions in Southeast Asia were focused mainly on Indochina, but they did interact with Indonesia through trade, diplomacy, and military expeditions. While France did not directly colonize Indonesia, their activities in Southeast Asia and the wider Pacific region often intersected with Dutch and British interests, contributing to the complex geopolitical dynamics of the time. In the early 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars, France had a brief moment of influence in Indonesia when French forces, under Napoleon's direction, briefly took control of the Dutch East Indies. In 1811, during the Napoleonic era, the British, in alliance with the French, occupied the island of Java, which was then a Dutch colony. After the defeat of Napoleon, control of Java was handed over to the British, and French influence waned. However, during the brief period of French control, French ideas about administration and governance had some influence on the region, particularly through the French-inspired reforms in Java introduced by the British governor, Sir Stamford Raffles, who was influenced by both British and French Enlightenment ideals. France's primary colonial interests in Southeast Asia, however, were focused on Indochina, and its colonization of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was more substantial and long-lasting. The French pushed to expand their colonial empire into Southeast Asia in the mid-19th century as part of their larger imperialist efforts. In terms of its interaction with Indonesia, French colonial policies, particularly those aimed at economic extraction and the organization of local labor forces in their own colonies, influenced colonial practices throughout the region, including in the Dutch East Indies. The French presence in Indochina became an example for other European powers, including the Dutch, in terms of resource extraction, plantation economies, and the enforcement of colonial authority. The French also played a role in the broader imperial competition in Southeast Asia, where their rivalry with the British and Dutch shaped the political landscape. In the 19th century, France and Britain were in competition for dominance in Southeast Asia, and this often led to diplomatic negotiations and treaties that affected Indonesia indirectly. The French competed with the British and Dutch over control of vital trade routes and resources, but by the late 19th century, France had largely focused its attention on Indochina and left Indonesia under Dutch control. This rivalry led to the establishment of spheres of influence in Southeast Asia, with the French focusing on Indochina, while the British and Dutch consolidated their colonial empires in other parts of the region. While France did not colonize Indonesia, its colonial practices in Indochina influenced the way European powers governed their Southeast Asian colonies. France's approach to resource extraction, labor management, and infrastructure development became models for other European powers. Furthermore, the influence of French Enlightenment ideas, particularly on governance and social order, affected the intellectual and political movements in the region, including Indonesia. After World War II, as Indonesia saw independence from Dutch rule, the broader context of anti-colonial movements in Southeast Asia, inspired by the experiences of former French colonies like Vietnam, had an indirect impact on Indonesia's own struggle for independence.